Welcome to Data Center Go-to-Market Sales and Marketing Q&A. I'm Joshua Feinberg from DCSMI, and I'm thrilled to welcome you to this week's show, where each week I tackle a handful of the biggest sales and marketing challenges that we're hearing about from all over the data center, critical facilities, and digital infrastructure ecosystems. If this is the first time you're joining us, welcome. We're thrilled to have you with us. If you've tuned into this live show before, welcome back. We're thrilled to have you with us as well. For many of you, it is good morning. For some of you, it is good afternoon. And for quite a few of you, it is already good evening, regardless of where you're tuning in from. Matter of fact, I'm super curious. Let us know in the comments, wherever you're watching us from, where you're joining us from, and what you do in and around data centers. If you want to make sure that you get notified about upcoming educational events and resources just like this, make sure that you're subscribed to our data center sales and marketing newsletter that comes to your email inbox each Sunday. You can sign up. You can subscribe directly on our website at www.dcsmi.com. So the Data Center Go-to-Market Sales and Marketing Q&A show is for you regardless of where you are in the data center ecosystem. Maybe you are part of a data center operator like a co-location, hyperscale, edge, modular, or wholesale data center provider. Perhaps you work in a technology or a facilities related company that sells to or partners with data centers. Maybe you do something related to construction or real estate or investment in and around data centers, critical facilities, or digital infrastructure. Or perhaps your company works in the outsourced marketing and sales segment of the data center, critical facilities, or digital infrastructure ecosystem. And this live show is for you regardless of where you sit on the go-to-market team. Perhaps you work in sales, such as an account executive, business development rep, sales development rep like an AE, a BDR, or an SDR. Or perhaps you work in post-sales, like some kind of account management role like an AM or a CSM like a client success manager. Or perhaps you work in some facet of marketing or events or product management or channel partnerships, or maybe you're the leader, the executive sponsor, the orchestra conductor that's responsible for building the right team, for recruiting the right people to get them in the right positions, playing at the right tempo, rowing the boat at the right speed, and making sure that your team is fully aligned and collaborating with each other to enable your company to pursue this great period of growth in all things related to data centers. So what is on the agenda for this week's show? We're going to first start by looking at how co-location data centers can stand out in crowded marketplaces. Next, we'll look at how a data center design, construction, and consulting firm can grow its pipeline. After that, we'll dive into how co-location, network services, and managed IT providers prepare for the future of data centers. Then we'll take a real quick break for a message from our sponsor. And in the second half of the Data Center Go-to-Market Sales and Marketing Q&A show this week, we'll talk about how hyperscale data centers streamline the sales cycle for deals, how co-location, managed IT, and connectivity solutions companies can compete with AWS, Amazon Web Services, Microsoft Azure, and Google Cloud. And as we head down the home stretch on this week's Data Center Go-to-Market Sales and Marketing Q&A show, we'll talk about how a data center MEP, architectural, mechanical, electrical, and plumbing infrastructure firms can attract engineering and design clients. If you have a challenge, a question, or a topic that you're currently working through that you'd like to add to the consideration queue for an upcoming episode, be sure to leave that in the comments wherever you are watching. So without any further delay, let's jump right into this week's first question, which is, how do co-location data centers stand out in the marketplace? How do co-location data centers stand out in the marketplace? That is an excellent question, and it's one I get dozens of times a year. And it never gets old because the marketplace is very dynamic. There's always new segments coming in. There's always new people approaching the market with new go-to-market strategies. There's always new vendors, new partnerships, new challenges. We know there's a tremendous amount of challenges going on facing co-location operators right now with density, with power grid availability, with a lack of talent. There's a whole bunch of challenges that companies are currently working through that are co-location data center operators. But if you're trying to differentiate, if you're trying to stand out in a crowded marketplace, there's a few different ways to approach this. And a lot of it depends on your size and your resources. So like if you're a huge data center operator, like a global data center operator, meaning that you work for a company like Digital Realty or Equinix, or if you're not global, you're at least on more than one continent, you're in dozens of locations, you have a way to differentiate simply by using your capital and using your resources and the massive amount of brand equity that you have. You can buy a bigger booth than anyone else at any conference on the planet. You can bring more of your team members to that conference than anyone else on the planet. You can have a bigger, more lavish after party, bringing in A-list celebrity performers at that conference. For the mid-level co-location data center operators, you're probably trying to do a lot of the same things that your even larger competitors are doing, but you're trying to do it within the resource constraints that you currently have. And then, so there's the giants, there's the mid-size, and by mid-size, these would typically be data center operators with at least 10 locations, maybe up to a few dozen locations nationally or globally. It could be as few as 5 or 10. Usually it's in the low double digits, 10, 20 or so locations spread across a single country and like kind of that mid-size. And then below that is the small independently owned co-location operators, typically characterized by 5 or fewer locations. Usually there's an owner operator that's heavily involved in day-to-day operations of the company in a single or 2 location, 3 location co-location data center. Often the operator, the owner, is also the CTO. Not always the case, but a lot of times that's how the whole company gets started in the first place. So with all of this, there's a different way to stand out in the marketplace. Again, publicly traded REITs, real estate investment trusts, they're going to do what they do best. They're going to be really large. They're going to have a tremendous amount of brand equity, relationship equity in the marketplace. And over time, they're still standing out by, in many cases, segmenting their go-to-market strategy, segmenting their marketing and sales a couple of different ways, usually by deal size and by industry. Deal size typically maps to having certain team members that work on enterprise deals where the sales cycle could literally be years and there's 7, 8 figures or more deal size at stake. A larger part of the marketing and sales organization will work on mid-market deals. Those are usually, depending on where you're located, those are 5 and 6 figure deals usually. Adjust for your local currency. And then there's SMB. Those are the reps, the teams that have the most amount of pressure to deal with a high volume of lower ticket transactions. And the extreme lower end of that market is where we see increasingly data center operators moving to self-service, self-sign up, self-onboarding, where those reps are largely moving out of those positions because the unit economics just don't work anymore to have humans selling things that can be purchased in a shopping cart and an e-commerce kind of transaction and self-onboarded. Actually, I try to keep these data center go-to-market sales and marketing Q&A shows pretty evergreen, but just as recently as a few weeks ago, one of the largest global data center operators shut down its bare metal operation. And what that, as it usually does, it brings a whole bunch of talented candidates reaching out and saying, hey, do you guys know who's hiring for this particular role? So there definitely is a changing and a shuffling around of resources as companies adjust to the reality of where the unit economics makes sense to have a traditional inside sales or outside sales process, and where it just doesn't anymore. In some cases, they're leaning more heavily on different kinds of channel partners to fill that gap. So the standing out really depends on your context. I'm going to focus a little more on how the smaller Co-location data center operator can stand out because I think they have the biggest challenges for standing out. With that in mind, I usually advocate for a two-pronged approach to your playbook. Approach number one for a co-location data center is to focus on hyperlocal. These are efforts that are all about getting more of the right people in your local marketplace to, one, know you exist, two, to come visit your facility, and three, ideally visit your facility multiple times in the context of professional development or learning development long before there's an immediate need to be in market for buying co-location data center services. So with that, you typically would look at your past track record, your ideal client profile, like where are these prospects and clients located? Typically for having local events in your facility, like literally in your conference room or your classroom or something similar to that, where you're inviting people in several times a year, I think ideally monthly for your prioritized buyer personas. So you're looking at geographically where they're located. Ideally, they can drive to your facility within 30 to 60 minutes of where they live and work. So that hyperlocal playbook might be supplemented by a company size parameter where you say, okay, they need to be within this driving radius and they're from companies that are, I don't know, for argument's sake, 10 employees up to 5,000 employees or 10 employees up to 500 employees, whatever your sweet spot is, where you've done best, where you've had the happiest, most profitable clients that aligns best with your core competencies that are on your roadmap for delivering today and in the very near future on your upcoming roadmap in the coming weeks and in the coming months. So there's their size, there's their geographic location, and you may also decide that it makes sense to specialize and stand out in the market with industry specialization, meaning that over time you look at your happiest, most successful, most profitable clients, you discover that, wow, we've gotten pretty good at financial services and healthcare. Everything else, I don't know, it's kind of low margin, brutal. We don't really have the team members that have that expertise, but for some reason over the years, we've done really well in financial services and healthcare. I'm like, that's fantastic. So let's figure out how we get more of the right IT decision makers and their colleagues and their organizations in these financial services and in these healthcare companies that are 30 to 60 miles away from where you live or kilometers, depending on where you're located, and are in the right company sizes. So you define your ideal client profile, go build your target account list, go do your persona research, understand who the most important and second most important kind of stakeholder is in these financial services and healthcare companies. And for the most important and second most important, let's study, let's research what's going on in their world. What do they need to accomplish individually, as a team, as a company, professionally, that's directly or indirectly related to IT infrastructure, to a need for co-location data center services. So that's the goals. And then what are they struggling with the most? What are their biggest challenges when it comes to digital infrastructure, when it comes to data center services, IT services, managed services, anything that's directly or indirectly related? We need the consensus on their biggest goals and their biggest challenges. And we need that consensus in their own words. Not what you think those words probably are, but what their words actually are. It's critical that we get their exact words. And we're going to do this through conversations with them, interviewing them, ideally in person or video chats or by phone. We can survey them. We can study how they describe themselves on their LinkedIn profile. We can see what kind of content that they share and they interact with. We can see what certifications they have, what skills they're endorsed for, what groups they belong to. We're going to take all of that together, and we want to look at a minimum of 10 or 20 people and get the consensus in their own words on their biggest goals and challenges for each one of these two prioritized segments. And then within each of these segments, we're going to use those 5 or 10 biggest goals and those 5 or 10 biggest challenges to put them in a simple worksheet or a simple calendar. And those are going to be the 5 or 10 first educational events that we're going to host in your facility to invite in IT professionals, IT-related decision makers, members of the committee, and various stakeholders from these companies to come learn with you about this big goal, about this big challenge, one goal and one challenge at a time. So if you identify 6 goals and 6 challenges, that's 12 topics, 12 months of the year, tackle one a month, invite a couple hundred people to each event, knowing that you're trying to max out the capacity of your room. Maybe your conference room or classroom comfortably seats 15 or 20. And say, for example, it's a breakfast seminar format. So you can invite, the event could be from, say, 8:30 in the morning till 10 a.m. From 8:30 to 10, there's continental breakfast and some networking. From 9 to 9:30, 9 to 9:45, there is a formal topic that you'll be talking about, conference grade content, teaching them some very useful skills and approaches and best practices that align with the goal or the challenge that you're tackling in that particular event topic for that particular month. Immediately following that, for anyone who's interested, you'll take them on a quick 10 or 15-minute tour around your facility, and you'll thank them for coming out. Make sure that they have your contact information, and lather, rinse, repeat. And the goal is, every time you do this, to have more people from the same company coming together, because we know, and this is the typical registration confirmation, whether it's an in-person event, whether it's a webinar, whatever, that, when it comes to cybersecurity for financial services technology, we know it truly takes a village. There's typically people involved from operations, compliance, finance, support, engineering. So with that in mind, who else should join you? Who else would also benefit from attending this breakfast seminar? Be shocked. That simple email that you send to them, and you're like, cool, there's like 3 people from the same company registered and attended. That's awesome. I'm starting to drive alignment across the decision committee. And you'll know this is really working, because not only do you get great anecdotal feedback and great survey feedback from the people that attended, next time around and you invite them, there's another 1 or 2 people from that same company all attending, to the point where like 50% of the room is filled up with people from this one company, and they take you aside afterwards. You're like, this is phenomenal. We should have you come in and present this to our whole IT organization. We get together once a month for a luncheon on Thursday afternoons. There's all 40 of us in attendance. Could you come in and give the same talk to everyone in our department? We're like, sure, that's awesome. The whole goal with this is to educate and build trust early and in the middle stages of the journey. So you're helping to drive the know, like, and trust when your prospects and clients are still in the formative stages, when you can shape the criteria that they use to evaluate all the different co-location options that are in front of them. Most co-location companies get stuck in the vendor box because they're only looped into those conversations at the absolute tail end. They're not getting in early enough. Make no mistake though, one of your competitors likely is. They're learning from someone. It could be a direct competitor, an indirect competitor, a non-business model competitor. Your goal should be to insert yourself into the professional development, into the learning development process and rituals and events of how they navigate, how multiple people from a target company are navigating how they figure out what they're going to do with IT infrastructure, how they figure out what they're going to do with digital infrastructure, and do this one persona at a time. It is amazingly more impactful for someone that works in healthcare tech in your greater local area to get invited to an event that uses those exact words, their words, and specifically mentions the kind of company and the kind of job role they have by name, and then does the exact same thing 2 weeks later for the other segment. So you have your 12-month, once a month series for financial services technology professionals, and you have your once a month series for healthcare technology professionals. And I said this was a 2-pronged challenge. So this is the people that are local. What about the people that are long distance, that are looking for co-location, but they can't easily drive to your facility for a breakfast seminar or lunch and learn or symposium or something? Take the exact same content and run it as a webinar and invite the people digitally. And you can't quite, I guess during the pandemic, people were sending out free lunch gift cards and things like that. You don't need to go to that length. Just provide great, helpful, relevant content that's hyper specific to who they are, what kind of job role they have in a specific kind of company size and a specific kind of region, and provide so much value that they're highly motivated to want to bring their coworkers along with them. So you're driving alignment during the early and the middle parts, the formative stages of that buyer's journey, which is super important, because by default, they're going to get 83% of the way through that decision-making process before they're ready to talk with someone from your sales team. We need to get in there well before that 83% point. Because if you wait till the game is 3/4 of the way over, 83% of the way over, it's too late. There's nothing you can do that's going to change their mind because someone else has already planted the seeds in their minds on anything and everything that's relevant to how they're going to decide who to partner with, who's going to be their co-location data center operator that they want to work with. So that's how co-location data centers can stand out in crowded marketplaces, regardless of whether you're focusing on local clients or whether you're focusing on long distance virtual clients that could be on the other side of your country, that could be on the other side of your continent, they could be on the other side of the planet. They're looking for space and power and cooling in your location, either for edge reasons, for latency reasons, for governance reasons, or some other reason that they will tell you about when they trust you enough because you've planted the seeds with these great educational resources and these great educational events. So that's how co-location data centers can stand out in the marketplace, even in incredibly crowded marketplaces. Next question up, what do we got? How does a data center design, construction, and consulting firm grow its pipeline, its sales pipeline? How does a company that focuses on data center design, construction, and consulting grow its sales pipeline? So let's get oriented with where we are within the data center ecosystem. So a company that's focused on design, construction, and consulting, they're not a data center operator, although some companies that are wholesale data center providers sometimes blur the line because they're very actively involved in the design and construction and consulting process because they're not actually operating the data center. They're usually looking for one major anchor tenants or something similar like that. But typically there's a big difference between the business models and go-to-market playbooks and the capital structure and everything having to do with data center operators compared to data center design, construction, and consulting. It's also not a data center technology company, and it's not a data center facilities related company. Like a technology company would specialize in like telecommunications, software, hardware, storage, cabling, connectivity, cybersecurity. A data center facilities related company would specialize in things like power, cooling, commissioning, decommissioning. Data center design, construction, and consulting is in the part of the data center ecosystem that we consider construction / real estate / investment. In other words, it has to do with deciding where data centers are going to be located, like site selection, planning the process, design, all of the dozens of multidisciplinary parts that go into the facilities construction and ultimately then commissioning, which is inside the facilities that jumps over to another part of the ecosystem. So, we put construction, real estate, and investment in the same part of the data center ecosystem. And then there's the fifth part of the data center ecosystem, outsourced sales and marketing. So data center design, construction, and consulting firms, to grow its pipeline, it needs to have a strong understanding of where it has historically done best, the kind of clients that have typically been the best fit. Because the data center industry is going through a period of what can best be described as hockey stick growth relative to what has been like over the past several years, pretty much every single week we get a data center developer reaching out for advice and insights on what they should be doing with their go-to-market strategy. Very similar because it's trying to grow its sales pipeline. And a lot of who they should be pursuing depends on how big their facility is, relative both in terms of square feet, square meters, and how many megawatts of power that they have available will largely determine, in many cases, whether they're going after small retail kind of co-location clients or massive like hyperscale wholesale kinds of clients, operators, or somewhere in between. In some cases too, what's super interesting in a lot of these conversations is many times we're helping them to think through both what a direct and indirect kind of go-to-market playbook would look like who would be channel partners in this scenario. It could certainly be like real estate companies, real estate brokers. For smaller co-location, it could be different kinds of channel partners like managed service providers, master agents, integrators, so a host of consultancies that for all intents and purposes are basically commission only channel partners. So for design, construction, and consulting, it really depends on how early in the life cycle you want to intercept someone. It could be investors. Investors ultimately have a huge say in where their capital goes for who they're working with for design and construction. When it comes to the site selection part of what precedes construction, community stakeholders are super important. When it comes to design, sometimes you're selling to operators, sometimes you're selling to hyperscalers, sometimes you're selling to enterprise that operate their own data centers. And depending on the size of the company, for really small companies, you're most of the time trying to build sales pipeline and get in front of C-level decision makers. For huge companies, you're not going to necessarily sell data center design, construction, and consulting to like the CEO of Oracle or the CEO of Microsoft or even the CEO of the cloud parts of those companies. There are dozens of people that work in mid-level leadership roles, mid-level executive management kind of roles, who focus on data center development, data center construction, and specifically are looking for relationships with companies like yours for various kinds of projects. So a lot of who your target is, your ideal client profile, who the buyer personas are, depend on how big your facility is and how big or small that particular client is. Because generally, the smaller the clients, the more likely it is that everyone knows everyone else, and the more likely it is that you have a single stakeholder that's wearing a lot of different hats. The larger the enterprise client is, when you're talking about selling to a company with tens of thousands of employees or more, you're going to need a much more expansive go-to-market in many cases that takes into account that it's a multidisciplinary kind of decision. Because if you don't have surface area among all the different kinds of stakeholders, it's very likely that you're going nowhere fast. So regardless of whether you're the designer, the construction firm, or the consulting firm, a lot of it is having self-awareness about what you've done successfully in the past, how big or how small your most successful clients are, what their business models were, where they tend to be located, and then looking to clone and repeat that. But the typical basics of documenting an ideal client profile, like the industry match, the company size, the location, building out a target account list, and understanding who the most important stakeholders are. When it comes to these huge projects, the more stakeholders that are involved, the more different segments that you really should be educating and building trust with, because it's very likely that if you're just focused on one or two of the segments, you may miss a huge part of the decision-making process that could sabotage the ability for you to successfully move from one deal stage to the next deal stage within your pipeline and ultimately get some of those projects across the finish line to closed won. What that means by definition is, like if you were just selling retail co-location to SMBs, kind of a much, much simpler part of the data center ecosystem, in most cases, 2, maybe 3 buyer personas, and you're all set. 2 or 3 different verticals, 2 or 3 different kinds of stakeholders, and you're good to go. It's very possible, but especially when you consider that your buyers of design and your buyers of construction may be completely different kinds of professionals and completely different kinds of companies. It's a different go-to-market playbook. They care about different issues, and the more dialed into understanding exactly what they're looking to achieve and exactly what they're struggling with, the easier it is for you to show up in a way that resonates, to make sure that your website, your digital brochure, and your lead generation offers and your educational events all align with what is top of mind for them. Because at the end of the day, we don't want to just show up as a data center design vendor or a data center construction vendor. We want to show up as the be-all, end-all experts on anything and everything that is adjacently related to data center design and adjacently related to data center construction. So in other words, not a vendor, not an account executive, not a sales development rep. Sure, you may need those traditional titles in your own internal org chart, but the reality is most of your clients would be a lot more excited about spending time learning from your internal subject matter experts, your internal consultants, your internal trusted advisors, it's far more likely that you're going to have much more meaningful conversations if you are able to successfully interact with your potential clients with that kind of positioning. It changes for sure the nature of who you hire. It changes how you approach upskilling and reskilling and cross-training and workforce development. And over time, you'll probably want to develop your own kind of internal training academy to get all of your new hires up to speed on the basics of being able to successfully have these kinds of conversations. In most cases, you'll likely want to anchor this to some kind of educational content marketing, thought leadership kind of program, which is kind of, for the most part, pretty non-intuitive for a lot of companies in this space. They think that they're selling these huge projects. They see huge companies that are allocating the majority of their budget to a presence, a really large presence at very expensive national and global conferences. And there certainly is a place for a certain amount of field marketing that is essentially paid events, paid media, that's kind of like paid media, because there's a captive audience there. And if you really do your homework, you really can find some events that are going to align well with your ideal client profile. But I would also caution you that when you have your ideal client profile documented and you know your buyer persona as well, it's one thing to attend an event. But if you're going to start buying a really big booth and a really big sponsorship at a particular event where it's taking up significant resources, both financially and your team's time, make sure before you commit to that event that you do some basic due diligence. On the left-hand side of your computer screen, have the media kit for the prospectus for sponsoring this year's event, along with the demographics, projected demographics and last year's demographics. And on the right-hand side of the screen, have your demographics, have your ideal client profile, have your buyer personas, and see how good of a match you get. And figure out, like, is most of that conference well aligned with our prioritized buyer personas? Is some of that conference aligned with our prioritized buyer personas, or is only a small sliver of that particular conference well aligned with our ideal client profile and our target buyer personas? If it's just that small sliver, you may want to think about how good you are at pursuing needle in haystack, or whether you want to reallocate your resources to where you have better odds. Remember, when you're at let's take a national conference where there's 2,500 people attending and there's 50 speakers. So of those 50 speakers, usually the speakers are coming with a couple of coworkers, a couple of people that work on their team. But if we just take the speakers, that's 50 out of 2,500. So roughly 2% of the people that are at that event are getting to educate and build trust. There could be another 2, 4, 6% of the people that work with one of the editorially positioned speakers at that particular event. So by extension, their team is getting to educate and build trust. For the other 90% of the people that are attending conferences, you're not educating and building trust. You're trying to basically insert yourself into someone else's education and trust building and hope that some of that bleeds over into your company. Sure, you can buy a booth, but again, with a small sliver of people at that event, maybe a large sliver if there's a good enough cocktail hour or good enough swag stopping by your booth, how much time are you really getting with the right people? And are you really getting that in the right context? Are you really able to educate and build trust? You could have a phenomenal after party. I've known some data center operators and other people with huge budgets in the space that throw fantastic parties. And it's a lot of fun and it helps to create brand awareness. But when you're in this club environment and having great hors d'oeuvres and an open bar and everything like that, is there really education and trust building going on? Same thing with the golf tournament. Heck of a lot of fun. Build rapport, build your brand personally and professionally. But how much education and trust building is really going on? That's a leading indicator for transformation when it comes to design and construction and consulting. So we're very partial to putting yourself in a place where you can educate and build trust with the right stakeholders in the right places at the right time and in the right context. So they see you and your team members as some of the top experts on the planet when it comes to data center design and construction. If you can do this successfully within the confines of a national or global conference, and you're actually getting in on editorial merits as opposed to having to pay to play, go for it. Do that often. If you're not meeting all of your needs from that, I would strongly recommend that you consider hosting your own educational events in person at one of your facilities, potentially doing a roadshow, certainly doing this virtually, and lather, rinse, and repeat with all of the above. And it's entirely possible that the buyer personas for your data center design business and your data center construction business are quite different. The better job you do at being hyper-specific, the more it is to cut through the noise. There's a tremendous amount of messages that are competing for attention in front of your ideal client. So the more hyper-specific you are about the title of your event, about the title of your webinar, about the title of your educational resources, the easier it is to grab someone by the virtual shirt collar on a busy feed and pull them into like, wow, how did they know what we were going through? Well, you figured out what they were going through because you got really tight on your ideal client profile. You got really dialed into their buyer persona, that customer insight research in their exact words. You know the top 12 goals and challenges that they're trying to address. And once a month, you're tackling one at a time in prioritized order by which ones you hear most often. So again, the goal is for you to educate and build trust with one or more stakeholders from your target accounts in an educational context. Because when they're learning with you, they're getting exposed to your frameworks and your methodologies and your best practices. And you're able to have a massive influence on how they navigate and compare all of those middle options that come up in the middle of their journey. And when you do this, you're nearly guaranteed, when you do this repeatedly and execute well, you're nearly guaranteed to get on the short list and stay on the short list. When you do this at a world-class elite level, your competitors will start to disappear from that short list. And on relatively small projects, it's fairly common that when you do this really well, you get to the end of the journey when they're finally ready for a sales conversation, and you may discover that there's no shortlist anymore. Your company is the shortlist of one, meaning that because you've used these educational events to build a deep, trusted advisor relationship with multiple stakeholders from the same company. Sure, with huge projects, it's not going to be quite that simple. But for small to mid-sized projects where they're not required to go through the crazy competitive bidding process, you're already there. The know, like, and trust is already built up. It's a much less price-sensitive buyer. So this is the playbook going forward. This playbook has been used extensively throughout the data center ecosystem for well over 10 years, heavily concentrated among operators and technology companies. More recently, in the past 5 years, especially among data center facilities related companies, and it's just starting to take off within data center construction, real estate, and investment companies because everyone's realizing the same thing. 10 years of digital transformation, millions of baby boomers retiring, Gen Zs and millennials in more decision-making roles. People are more sales allergic than they've ever been. The way that you earn your way in early and often to get a virtual seat on their side of the table is getting out of that vendor box and instead showing up as a teacher, a consultant, a subject matter expert, a trusted advisor, perhaps even a thought leader. When you do this well, this will for sure build your sales pipeline in a very, very strong and powerful way that neutralizes most of the competitive options that your prospects, that your future clients might have in a different context considered. So that is how a data center design, construction, and consulting firm can grow its sales pipeline in today's self-driven buyer's journey for data centers, digital infrastructure, and critical facilities. Next question, what do we got? How does a colocation, network services, and managed IT provider prepare for the future of data centers? How does a colocation, network services, and managed IT provider prepare for the future of data center? That's a terrific question, and it's one we're talking about a lot. Increasingly, what we're seeing is in years past, in a past era, there were co-location sales playbooks that were heavily focused on selling real estate with power and cooling kind of tacked on as amenities. And most of the IT services was not done by the co-location operator. It was done either by the client's internal IT staff or by external equivalents like integrators, consulting firms, managed service providers. Increasingly, co-location companies that are facing a tremendous amount of competition and struggling for differentiation are realizing that not only can they stand out from the crowd and have a bigger share of wallet and more account control by getting involved in IT services, they can elevate the positioning of their firm, the kind of relationships that they have with their clients, and be in a much more financially diversified, healthier profit margin kind of business by being in IT services that happens to own and operate co-location data centers, as opposed to remote hands and things like that being an afterthought. So increasingly, we're seeing the convergence of these business models of co-location network services and managed IT services in a way that, frankly, I'm surprised it took so long, because from like the 2010s on, we started to see a lot of co-location operators, especially independently owned single and 2 or 3 location co-location operators, that were selling to the exact same kinds of SMB clients, small and medium-sized business clients, as managed service providers, as MSPs. It was really, really bizarre. And it resonated with me a lot because I first started working with that part of the data center ecosystem in the early 2010s, when I saw a lot of the MSPs and IT consulting and network integrators that I've been working with for the previous 15 years struggling with their business models as the world moved from client server premise based over to SaaS and cloud. I saw it was really strange is that they were both going after the exact same clients. And it must have been confusing the heck out of a non-technical small business owner who was not a career IT professional. Like, you have these 2 different firms that the only difference between the 2 of them is one can come on site and will go to our data center, and the other one only does things remotely and won't come on site to our office. And like, this is crazy. They were both relatively small, closely held firms. They both attracted the kind of clients who loved the idea of being able to have access to the CEO of the company, the owner of the company, because it was a company, the MSP or the co-location operator was 5, 10, 20, maybe 50 employees at the most. So they absolutely loved the idea of being able to get that kind of C-level access to someone that was hands-on. But in both of these scenarios, both with the colo operator and the MSP, they struggled a lot with unit economics, with finding a cost-effective way to grow their client list relative to the relatively modest lifetime value of their clients. Some of them figured it out better than others. Some of them, in addition to having their own space, rented space and other co-location, much bigger co-location operators in different parts of their region, different parts of the country, maybe even in different parts of the world. So they were able to go after more sophisticated mid-market and enterprise clients. But at a basic level, those relatively small companies really struggled a lot with their go-to-market, with figuring out marketing and sales. And in the world we live in now, where so much of a typical B2B technology buyer's journey is trending towards self-service, it's become even more challenging. So there's like 2 different thought processes going on what it takes to prepare for the future of data centers. From an operations and a technology and a facility standpoint, we know that the power density requirements are insane relative to what they were as recently as 5 or 10 years ago. GPUs take a lot of power. They require a massive amount of cooling. And short of having like one server sitting in a rack and the rest being blanking panels, this is kind of the state of where we are right now. So there's a lot of co-location data centers that may not be that old, that may have been built like in the last 5, 7, 10 years, that are facing potentially premature obsolescence if they're only able to attract the kind of clients that have these high density workload demands. Now, should they repurpose and reposition themselves as edge data centers so they can take more traditional, conventional workloads and not be obsoleted out of the market? Perhaps. That's been a lot of interesting conversations we've had in recent months as well. If there's a repositioning exercise that needs to happen where legacy co-location essentially becomes more valued because of edge, but that's a completely different playbook as well, because the edge doesn't revolve around you creating regional awareness. It's extraordinarily precise awareness where you're looking for the client that values and is willing to essentially pay a premium for the fact that your facility is 1,000 feet, 1,000 meters, whatever it is, located nearby something that's that strategically important to that particular company, whether it's IoT, whether it's EVs, whether it's smart city, some kind of low latency AI or financial trading application or something like that. So that's the technology and operations and facilities part of the future of data centers. There's also the go-to-market part of the future of data centers that impacts co-location network services and managed IT companies. And increasingly, we're seeing the low-end part of this market look a lot like the web hosting business started to look like 10 years ago, where the only companies that are truly going to survive with brutally competitive, low-margin kind of businesses are huge, that they have large unit economics to scale. Most of these single location co-location operators that I work with in the 2010s have long since exited to be merged into larger co-location operators. In other words, it just wasn't, whether it was technology staff, operations staff, facility staff, sales and marketing, or capital, or all of the above, they needed that economies of scale, not just in operations and capital and finance and sales and marketing, but really all of the above to be competitive and to be able to attract and retain more sophisticated clients. If you just sheerly look at like, what does it take to build a small to mid-sized facility now compared to like 10 years ago, like night and day, right? So all of that is one big up-leveling on all of this. So there's the preparing for both the technology and facilities realities, and there's the preparing for the go-to-market realities that impact marketing, sales, post-sales, like account management, retention, support, product decisions, where to invest in capabilities, what product lines, what kinds of services and amenities to offer versus where to partner. And increasingly, what I see in co-location, regardless of the size of the co-location operator, is there's this tremendously renewed interest in a more indirect kind of playbook, more channel partner heavy than ever. And with that in mind, I think that is self-service and self-onboarding is a big part of the future of that kind of business model, especially at the entry-level price points, the entry-level commoditized kinds of co-location. I think increasingly you're going to see CFOs and boards of directors and investors of these companies demanding that these companies invest more aggressively in building channel partnerships because of what it does to the CapEx, OpEx kind of equation, and being able to reach highly fragmented nooks and crannies that are just not cost effective to reach with your own go-to-market. The big caution that I always tell people, though, is if you're brand new to channel partnerships, if you've never done this at scale before, leave more time than you think you need. You're likely at this stage pretty comfortable with estimating from the time you decide that you're going to hire an account executive or hire an account manager and you post the job, how long it's going to take to get your shortlisted candidates through a couple of rounds of interviews, to make an offer to one of them, to have them give their 2 weeks notice, have them come in and get onboarded and be fully ramped and productive. You probably know it's a certain amount of weeks or a certain amount of months, right? With channel partners, you're largely looking for a fractional outsourced commission only, project only version of that on the sales and marketing side and even on the services side. The challenge is, instead of that AE or that AM or that marketer or whatever is working for you full-time, 40, 50 hours a week or whatever it is, your channel partner is typically involved in 5, 10, 15, 20 or more different channel partner programs, in addition to all of the work of building their business and strategic client relationships. As a result, they don't have the ability to pay that much attention to you. And it's a lot harder to get on their radar screen in the channel partner journey. And remember, just like with SaaS, when a new channel partner is onboarded, that's just another starting line. That's not a finish line. It's just another starting line. And that's where you need to have fantastic channel partner onboarding and channel partner enablement. I've worked on channel partner enablement programs on and off in several different chapters of my career, and it can be phenomenally powerful. But a lot of companies, especially smaller companies in the data center ecosystem, do a very wishful thinking way of looking at that. In other words, they're thinking that their channel partners are going to ramp and be fully productive and enabled and bringing them deals, maybe a little slower than in-house employees, but nowhere near the reality where things that would take weeks as a full-time person could take months or longer. Sure, you can get the timing perfect every once in a while. And if you have enough channel partners and they're dealing with enough IT infrastructure emergencies, you can get lucky every once in a while. But for the most part, it is a long game. The cool part with it being a long game is you may have channel partners that are with you for way longer than your average employee tenure. That's an interesting debate, arm wrestling match competition that you could potentially have between your HR leader, your people leader, and your channel partnerships leader. Oh, we won all these awards on Glassdoor as Employer of the Year, and we have an average tenure of 7.1 years. And your channel champion comes back and says, "Oh yeah, that's nothing. In my previous job, we had these kind of stats, and we drove this kind of results." So it's a really, really interesting playbook that we're going to see a lot more of with the future of data centers, especially among capital constrained and margin constrained companies that are focusing on co-location, network IT services, and managed IT services. But like at a high level, that's what I would consider both on the real estate density, capital, and staffing sides of the business, as well as on the go-to-market strategy part of the business, the marketing and sales playbooks, is leaning into the self-driven buyer's journey, leaning into channel partner strategies, recognizing that it's more competitive and harder than it's ever been. People are more sales allergic than it's ever been. And it's entirely possible that going forward, how you allocate headcount between direct and indirect go-to-market, having your own marketing funnel, your own marketing playbook, your own SDRs, BDRs, account executives, and AMs, as opposed to having channel marketing, channel consultants, channel account managers. Again, these are strategic decisions that are usually decided at the board level, but these are for sure areas, topics, themes that leadership is talking about within companies that are focused on colo, network, and managed services. So that's how I would approach how colocation, network services, and managed IT providers can prepare for the future of data centers. We're going to take a real quick break for a message from our sponsor. And when we come back, we're going to tackle 3 more of the biggest sales and marketing challenges faced by data centers, critical facilities, and digital infrastructure.
Data Center Go-to-Market Sales and Marketing Q&A is sponsored by DCSMI, elevating the role of sales marketing and go-to-market GTM professionals in the growth of the data center industry. To stay informed about upcoming episodes, subscribe to the Data Center Sales and Marketing newsletter on the DCSMI website at www.dcsmi.com. Again, that's www.dcsmi.com. Now, back to Data Center Go-to-Market Sales and Marketing Q&A.
Hey there, it's Joshua Feinberg from DCSMI, the Data Center Sales and Marketing Institute. We are all about elevating the role of sales, marketing, and go-to-market professionals in the growth of the data center industry. And you're tuned into our weekly live show, the Data Center Go-to-Market Sales and Marketing Q&A show, where each week I tackle a handful of the biggest sales and marketing challenges in and around the data center industry. If you're getting good value from this week's show so far, make sure that you help spread the love, help spread the word by hitting the like button on whatever platform that you're watching on it. If you have an idea for a topic or a question or a challenge that you think we should address in an upcoming show, be sure to leave that in the comments wherever you're watching, and we will add that to the consideration queue for tackling in an upcoming episode. So what do we got up next? Our next question is, how do hyperscale data centers streamline the sales cycles for deals? How do hyperscale data centers streamline the sales cycle for deals? That's a terrific question. And it's interesting, whenever this comes up, what a lot of people that are relatively new to the ecosystem don't realize that is, like, if you're building a marketing and sales playbook or a go-to-market playbook for a co-location data center operator, it's very likely that your ideal client profile, your total addressable market, your target account list has your company pursuing potentially hundreds, if not thousands, of accounts in each market that you operate within. When you're a hyperscale data center operator, how many hyperscalers are there really that are looking for presence in your local area? Probably a few dozen. So what that means is it's a lot more concentrated. There's a lot more at stake. These are huge deals. And by the nature of these being huge deals, the great part with your marketing and sales and go-to-market playbook is you can afford to make investments that you never would be able to afford to make if you were just selling retail co-location. The flip side of that is everyone that you're competing with, for the most part, is also very open to making huge investments in creating awareness and educating and building trust with the most important stakeholders in these huge hyperscale companies that are potentially looking for space in one or more data center facilities like yours. So the best way to streamline the sales cycle is to figure out, like, where is the pattern recognition? Where is your consistency? And in a lot of ways, I think this is where some companies do really well and other companies really struggle. And when it comes to, like, mapping go-to-market, when it comes to sales and marketing, we want to look at where you've been most successful in the past. Like, if you're allowed to parade around their logos, which you may or may not be due to various covenants, look at your logos and case studies and reviews and testimonials on your website. In the case of hyperscale data centers, you're usually not allowed to talk about that stuff publicly. So this is an exercise of going into your CRM. And in your CRM, in particular, look at where your biggest sources of revenue and your biggest sources of profit are coming from within those hyperscale companies, and which have the highest net promoter score, which are able to, where you've been able to grow those accounts the most. And we're trying to figure out is, like, what do they have in common? What kind of patterns can we observe if we have a lot of self-awareness and we figure out where we've been successful versus where we haven't, and what kind of environments and what kind of locations, what kinds of sizes, what kinds of stakeholders. From that, we should be able to not only build a ideal client profile, even more importantly, for hyperscale deals, because there's a lot of times several different stakeholders, different kinds of stakeholders that are involved. We need to really do our homework with figuring out how to map these accounts. In other words, all the different stakeholders from these particular hyperscale prospects that we need to essentially create awareness in front of and win over, essentially educate and build trust. And if you were just, keep going back to the comparative example, if you were just selling, like, retail co-location to small and medium-sized businesses, it's possible that you have 2 or 3 different kinds of segments, 2 or 3 different kinds of buyer personas, and you study the heck out of their goals and challenges in their own words about what your primary, your secondary, maybe your tertiary buyer persona cares about the most when it comes to digital infrastructure in the journey to making a decision on co-location data centers. For hyperscalers, oh, you wish it was that simple, that there's only 3 different kinds of stakeholders. There's possibly 3 that matter most. And this is, again, digging into your CRM history of your most successful clients and looking at who's on the threads, who's attended the meetings, who is involved in various kinds of sign-offs, both pre and post sales, and see if you can narrow it down to the 3 or 4 or 5 categories of stakeholders that were relevant across the board When you're able to do that and you know which one had the most economic impact, that's your primary. The second most important impact, that's your secondary. Increasingly, some of these hyperscale deals are so ridiculously large that the holy grail 5 or 10 years ago used to be getting to the CTO, or at least the CTO's direct reports. On some of these massive deals, the CTO is still involved, but the CTO may only be a secondary stakeholder now, and it's the CEO and one or more members of the boards of directors that are involved, because the financial impact is so much larger than it was 5 or 10 years ago. So again, a lot of this depends on how big your facility is in terms of power, in terms of size. A lot of it depends on how big their particular company is, but being able to segment up who the different stakeholders are that you're trying to build relationships with is incredibly important, because those essentially are one at a time the people that we need to not only make aware that we exist, but to essentially win over. And we want to ideally get in early and get in often. By early, what does that mean? If we know it is their job to always be sourcing new potential locations, new potential facilities for hyperscale, in a perfect world, we'd love to get the timing perfect. We'd love to have our lead generation offer, our event invitation land when they are in the 5 or 10% of the people that are currently in market, meaning they're going to be making a decision in the next couple of weeks. The reality, though, is the much wider part of your funnel, the much wider part of your addressable market are the people that are in the perfect job functions in the perfect company that are going to be buyers of hyperscale in your particular location, but it may be anywhere from a couple of weeks to a couple of months away. You'd be like, well, why would we want to get to them early and why we want to get to them often? Because the ones that are able to get in early and often are the ones that are able to shape the criteria that they use to evaluate all of the different options that are in front of them. It's nearly impossible to get the timing perfect, but what you can do for your target accounts is to increase the amount of surface area that you have in these accounts by more of the right people knowing that you exist, knowing just how smart some of the people are on your team when it comes to anything and everything having to do with digital infrastructure that would be relevant in the context of hyperscale data centers. And again, what they care about is going to vary quite a bit depending on the persona, depending on their particular role within that company and how they tend to look at your category. Like, for example, the CISO, the Chief Information Security Officer, probably cares about different things than the Director of Network Operations. And the Director of Network Operations may care about something completely different than someone that's involved in GRC and governance, risk, and compliance. And that person may care about completely different issues than a CFO. And that a person may care about something completely different than someone that's on the environmental side, like an ESG kind of person that's working on sustainability initiatives. And the board of directors, they may have completely different concerns about hyperscale data centers. So there's 5 or 6 stakeholders, some of which may be more important than others, depending on the nature of the organization. There's data center developers, there's data center construction, there's investment officers, in addition to the financial officers. All of these factor into some degree of weighing in on hyperscale. Your job is to figure out for where you're located, how big or small your company is, and how big or small their company is, to decide which ones you want to invest aggressively in and which have less relevance. And again, your context is going to vary tremendously by the nature of your business model, their business model, your size, their size. And over time, it will get easier. You'll get product market fit, you'll get go-to-market fit, and you'll have answers to all of these questions, and you'll know exactly what to concentrate on because you're building very similar hyperscale data center facilities in each new market that you move into. But initially, if you're just running a lot of experiments, and so far you've built 3 different facilities and they're all a little different and all a little quirky, and you haven't really standardized that, it's tough to get to that product market fit. I interviewed someone a little while back who works in physical security. He works for a company called DHbase. His name is Ben Myers. You can look him up on our podcast. And he talked about the idea that one of the biggest challenges that data center are dealing with is this idea of data centers being individual snowflakes, where each data center is built completely individually. There's no standardization across the board. And Ben's company focuses on one particular aspect of the supply chain. And if the supply chain doesn't line up perfectly, it's a nightmare for getting the right physical security equipment and installations and everything going at the right timing and coordinating everything else that needs to happen. It's a similar kind of thing to anything when it comes to commissioning, when it comes to hiring, when it comes to go to market. If you're all over the place and you don't have like a standardized platform for how you site select and how you design and how you construct these hyperscale facilities, good luck getting any traction and getting good at the go to market and sales and marketing aspects of that. Over time, the data center operators that are in the space that do really well get really good at certain kinds of parameters, certain kinds of playbooks. And because of that, it becomes a copy and paste. It becomes a lather, rinse, and repeat as they move to looking to find an anchor tenant or fill facilities or fill campuses in different kinds of regional markets. So as you can probably start to surmise, these are very, very strategic decisions that are not going to be made in a vacuum by your sales leader. They're not going to be made in a vacuum by your marketing leader or your product leader or your head of client success. These are decisions where for sure each of those leaders will have a vote and a stakeholder role in how these are ultimately implemented. But these are very high level strategic decisions for hyperscale data centers that usually get decided all the way up at the C level. And depending on the size of your company, if you're fewer than say 500 employees or something like that, it's very common for the CEO and the CTO to be very, very hands-on in a lot of these decisions around standardization and process. And after they hand it off, it'll get handed off to a chief product, chief marketing, chief sales, chief revenue that builds the playbook and the go-to-market and the execution on all of this. In much larger companies, there's layers of people that get involved in these kinds of conversations. But again, at the end of the day, it's almost like imagine, I don't know how many of you are watching have ever been entrepreneurs, but there's a legendary playbook that entrepreneurs swear by. Like in the software SaaS industry, people swear by the Lean Startup by Eric Ries. For entrepreneurs in general, there's a very well-known entrepreneur author that's been around for decades who wrote the E-Myth, Michael Gerber. And even if your business has nothing to do with food services or brick and mortar and everything because you're in IT services, it's the idea of standardization and process that is incredibly important. In the dozens of podcast interviews where I talk about people that have scaled businesses in IT services and in facilities and various phases of construction and real estate, standardization process, a standard platform is incredibly important to being able to do all of this at scale. So when it comes to streamlining your sales cycle for deals for a hyperscale data center, get crystal clear on your ideal client profile, get crystal clear on your go-to-market playbook. But at the end of the day, your ability to see the pattern recognition and streamline anything and everything on the marketing and sales side is going to largely be a function of how streamlined the construction and the commissioning and the build out process is among your hyperscale data center facilities. The more similar they are and the more similar the target accounts, the more similar your marketing and sales playbook can be for streamlining your sales cycle. The more dissimilar they are, you're literally like doing custom work every single time. And it's like the opposite of where you actually want to be. So that may not have been the answer that you expected, but I think there's a lot to be said for getting really, really dialed into what you're going to take to cookie cutter the business across multiple locations as you look to scale, and willing to bet if you're having this conversation with your investors like VCs and private equity, they're also going to want to see the same kind of thing, which is why in so many parts of data center operators that are driven by mergers and acquisition, if you talk to people in operations and finance and marketing and sales for a good 6, 12, 18 months post-acquisition, what is it all about? Standardization, right? So that's my insights. That's my advice and tips and best practices on how hyperscale data centers can streamline the sales cycle for their deals. Okay, what do we got up for our next question? So next, we're going to talk about competing with public cloud providers, in particular, how colocation, managed IT, and connectivity solutions companies can compete with AWS, Amazon Web Services, Microsoft Azure, and Google. How colocation, managed IT, and connectivity solutions companies can compete with AWS, Azure, and Google. There's a couple of different ways that you can potentially compete. One of the more popular ways to compete that's been very, very well covered in recent years is the CFO's perspective, Chief Financial Officer's perspective, where 5 or 10 years ago, the CFO and the board were sold on this vision that moving everything into public cloud would not only be faster and more flexible, but it'd be way, way, way less expensive than building and operating your own data centers or placing all of your digital infrastructure in co-location facilities or something similar. There's been a lot of very, very, very well documented cases of this whole idea of repatriation, where repatriation is all about companies having decided that public cloud didn't work out for them in that particular use case for financial reasons, flexibility reasons, compliance, governance reasons, control. In many cases, it's just dollars. It's just financial budgetary reasons. And there's an enormous financial incentive now to repatriate those assets back into co-location data centers. So that's certainly one aspect of competing with AWS, Azure, and Google, is understanding that whether you call it a primary buyer persona or a secondary buyer persona, there's a strong argument for doing customer insight research with 10, 15, 20 CFOs of companies that fit your ideal client profile perfectly, that are heavily invested in public cloud, and to understand the biggest goals and the biggest challenges that are a leading indicator that the CFO and potentially the board members that the CFO reports to are beyond fed up with public cloud costs, and they're openly questioning the wisdom of doing this in the first place and putting pressure on their IT internal equivalents to work on a plan for bringing those assets back out of public cloud and into co-location facilities. So that's certainly, whether that's your primary or your secondary buyer persona, understand the CFO's biggest goals and challenges and build fantastic educational resources and educational events that are going to resonate with that CFO. If your own company's CFO, internal or fractional equivalent, is interested in being able to be I wouldn't say spokesperson, but a teacher, consultant, trusted advisor on issues that would resonate with one of their peers in a similar company, that could be a great person to be the moderator or host or lead person on your monthly webinar series or your monthly breakfast seminars or lunch and learns specifically that are targeted to CFOs of these kinds of companies. In addition to CFOs, there have also been a lot of cases of the CISO, of the Chief Information Security Officer, cybersecurity concerns driving the need to exit out of public cloud back into co-location facilities where there's a lot more control over the infrastructure. Latency issues, depending on the nature of your application and whether those public cloud providers are giving you the regional coverage, the regions that you specifically need, could also be a strong argument for having a lot more precision, a lot more control of where these assets actually live. Governance reasons. So, you'd have on the infrastructure locations, you'd have potentially a cybersecurity executive. You could have an IT infrastructure executive. There's also a legal compliance governance kind of issue that could come up with deciding that, hey, this whole public cloud thing isn't working out. We need to have a lot more precision over where these assets are located. And that may be driven by in-house legal, general counsel kind of things. It's not that likely that would be a primary buyer persona, but it could be a secondary or tertiary kind of persona, depending on the nature of their business. But yeah, there's a lot of different ways to go at competing with the cloud. For a more SMB, a small to mid-size kind of sale, where you're dealing with an owner of a company, or it's being addressed by a CTO of a relatively small company that has a relatively small IT organization, they may want to have a lot more control over just where IT infrastructure lives. because they haven't had the flexibility that they've needed in the past to be able to get the work done that they want. Not much different than on enterprise, except you're able to push on especially for a smaller co-location managed IT and connectivity solutions company, is if that particular person in a smaller company really felt like they were getting the runaround and not able to escalate properly because their account is so small and relative to the size of kind of enterprise accounts of these big public cloud companies, it's entirely possible that that person having access to the CTO of your company or CEO of your company, depending on your company's size, which, at like 30, 40, 50 employees is very practical. At 500 or 1,000 employees, yeah, it depends on how big of an account they are relative to your size of the company. But yeah, for sure, it could be super interesting to the IT leader, the CTO of a local company that's fed up with not getting what they're looking for from the public cloud, to have access to your CTO of your company, who happens to be the speaker at some of your webinars or your breakfast seminars or lunch and learns and joins in on some of these events. So that could be really appealing to you as well. So when it comes to how a co-location operator, when it comes to how a technology provider that's in managed IT services or connectivity services addresses how they're going to compete head to head with the big public cloud companies, a lot of the decision on how to run this playbook depends on how big your company is and how big their company is. And the bigger their company it is, the more likely it is that you're going to need a much more granular go-to-market approach, segmenting and personalizing that content for a much bigger variety of stakeholders that weigh in on these conversations. And in an enterprise environment, I wouldn't be surprised if you told me there's hundreds of people that are indirectly at least involved with the decision on where public cloud services are happening versus the decision to potentially repatriate into either enterprise data centers or rented co-location space. In a much smaller company, it's not hundreds. It could be a handful. It could be smaller than a handful. It could be a couple fingers on a handful that are ultimately going to weigh in on the decision of whether to stay with public cloud, to stay with AWS, to stay with Azure, to stay with Google Cloud, versus to decide to move some or all of that back. And the some or all, I think, is a big thing to point out as well, because in a lot of cases, this isn't an all or nothing kind of thing. And it's very common for co-location, data center co-location operators to have direct connections to the big three, to one or more of the big three public cloud providers. It's very common to provide private cloud. It's very common to provide hybrid cloud. It's not an all or nothing in many cases. Depending on the sophistication level of your clients, there's a lot of opportunities here. But at the end of the day, for a relatively small to mid-sized company competing with AWS, Azure, and Google, competition may not be the best approach that many of your peers are taking. In many cases, they look at it as a partnership. Otherwise, they wouldn't have invested the resources to have these direct connects. They wouldn't be thinking about hybrid. They wouldn't be thinking about private. They wouldn't be thinking about channel partnerships with companies that bring talent in and around cloud services and managed services. So it's not really an us versus them in many cases. It could be, and depending on the nature of their clients, but in a lot of cases, I think it's a lot more subtle. But at the end of the day, if you have a pretty good handle on who your core clients are and you know their motivations for why they've come to you, and a lot of their motivations is exiting public cloud, and you want to be able to replicate that kind of client opportunity, yeah, for sure. Look at among those particular clients that exited cloud and came to you, where they were located, how big or small their companies are, what industries they tended to be within, and who are the typical kind of stakeholders, what do they care most about, and then take all of that insight and have great website pages, great lead generation offers, great webinars, great in-person events, a great email newsletter, great podcasts, all of the above, to make it super abundantly clear that you have a tremendous amount of expertise in helping that kind of stakeholder in that kind of company navigate the decision as to whether it should be all public cloud, all co-location, or pick and choose a little bit from each column, depending on which is best for their particular. And the more it's not an all or nothing, that largely is going to drive some hiring decisions on your part as well, because you're going to need account executives, you're going to need account managers who basically are at like a advanced beginner to strong intermediate level, comfortable, fluent in some of these public cloud platforms. So yeah, it changes the nature of who you hire. It changes the nature of how you invest in upskilling and reskilling and professional development, and having allowances available or requirements for mandatory training and certification, or teams all learning together. I interviewed a go-to-market leader for IBM Consulting that deals in cloud migration and modernization projects, and we talked specifically about how their team standardizes on certain kinds of training and certification programs. If you're curious to look that up, it was an interview I did a little while back on the Data Center Go-to-Market podcast with Priyanka Ray, Dr. Priyanka Ray from IBM Consulting in Singapore. So it's a really, really big issue that comes up a lot with hiring, especially in the account executive, especially in the account management kind of roles. And it certainly helps if your marketing, your events team has some basic understanding of what the ecosystem issues are. But at the end of the day, it's really about dialing in your client profile, dialing in your personas, understanding what's going on in their world, and figuring out a way that you can add value as a teacher, as a consultant, as a trusted advisor, and not just the co-location vendor or the managed IT services vendor. Get out of that vendor box as quickly as possible and do everything that you can to stay out of that vendor box. So that's how I would approach how a co-location managed IT and connectivity solutions company can compete with AWS, Azure, and Google Cloud. So that brings us to our final question for this week's Data Center Go-to-Market Sales and Marketing Q&A show. If you've gotten good value out of this week's show, make sure that you hit the like button to help spread the word. And if you have an idea for a question or a topic, or a challenge that you think we should address in an upcoming show, be sure to leave that in the comments and we'll add it to the consideration queue for an upcoming episode. So final question, what do we got? How does a data center MEP infrastructure firm attract engineering and design clients? So data center, architectural, mechanical, electrical, plumbing infrastructure firm attract engineering and design clients? That is a fantastic question. And I can tell you without a doubt that if your firm is heavily competent in architecture and mechanical engineering and electrical and plumbing, you probably have a pretty large firm at the outset, which means that you should have the resources to be able to execute on most of what I'm going to describe. If you're a relatively small firm that's involved in all of these areas, I would encourage you to niche down into some areas where you think you can successfully land and expand because you have a tightly defined area of expertise. So for attracting the engineering and attracting the design clients, the biggest challenge with all of this is trying to figure out if there really is one or two common prospects and clients that allow you to sell all of these services to the exact same clients. And there just might be. Maybe it's a certain kind of hyperscaler, maybe it's a certain kind of co-location operator, maybe it's a certain kind of enterprise data center, maybe it is someone that's involved in construction, development, investment within this kind of firm. Maybe it's in an investor who's heavily involved in digital infrastructure investments, basically the funding that goes into building massive data center projects. But at the end of the day, there could potentially be a lot of different segments, a very vague kind of ideal client profile, and very vague ideal client profiles are tough to do well. So either we need to come to the conclusion that you need more than one go-to-market, which means more than one go-to-market team in most cases, a separate pod with a minimum of some sales talent and some project talent and some marketing and events kind of talent, or you need to figure out the holy grail of like where these four circles on the Venn diagram all intersect. Who's the magic client that needs help with architecture and mechanical engineering, electrical engineering, and plumbing, specifically in the context of needing engineering and design services. Like I mentioned before, it's very possible it's a hyperscaler. It's very possible it's a co-location operator. It could be a enterprise that builds their own data centers and wants a lot of control over the decisions that get made with this. What a lot of this is making sure you don't spread yourself too thin, though. And a lot of making sure you don't spread yourself too thin is to look at where you've done best in the past. When you look at your financials, when you look in your CRM, like what kinds of clients are actually paying the bills, both currently and in the recent past? And who do you essentially want to clone if you can copy and paste 5, 10, 20 more clients just like that in the coming weeks, in the coming months? What do they have in common? Where do they tend to be located? How big or small are their firms? What industries they tend to be located in? And I think the biggest challenge of all is figuring out not only the couple dozen or couple hundred, or it's probably a couple hundred. It's more than likely not just a couple dozen, and it's certainly not a couple thousand. It's probably a couple hundred companies that are on your target account list that meet that ideal client profile. But within those companies, are they size clustered enough that you can get some pretty strong consensus on which stakeholder is most influential, which stakeholder has the second most influence, the second most economic power in that buying decision on engineering and design, which is the third most? Because if you're all over the place in the company sizes that you target, it's very, very difficult to get that tight on who the people are that you most need to build awareness with and educate and build trust with. And if you don't know who the people are, it's really difficult to know what they're struggling with the most and what they're trying to figure out. That has to do with engineering, data center engineering, and data center design. If you do have a lot of clarity and you've said, okay, we've really dialed in, these companies tend to be in our metro area or 2 or 3 other metro areas where you have physical presence, because when it comes to this business model, this is almost certainly not going to be delivered long distance. You're almost certainly going to need to have physical presence in that area. And in those particular one or more regions, most of our clients have tended to be from companies that have, say, 500 to 5,000 employees. It's not super tight, but it's certainly tight enough. What you're basically saying is below 500 employees, they probably can't afford us. And above 5,000 employees, we're probably not competitive enough to win out against huge companies that do what we do. So let's say you have it dialed into, like, you're looking for clients between 500 and 5,000 employees in this particular geographic region, and they tend to be from these 3 or 4 industries. That backs into a target account list, and from there, figuring out who the people are in those companies is largely a function of looking at where historically you've done best, which stakeholders matter the most to you getting in the right context early enough to be able to build considerable mind share with that stakeholder and all of their coworkers. Because at the end of the day, if you do a good enough job on your content, on your educational resources, your educational events, it should be very, very natural when someone downloads, when someone subscribes, when someone registers to say, hey, look, when it comes to best practices for data center design for telecommunications companies or whatever it is, it takes a village. There's usually people involved from these 3 or 4 different roles, job functions. So who else should be reading this? Who else should be watching this? Who else should attend this? And that's when you start to see, oh, cool. Like, sure, I can look in LinkedIn Sales Navigator. I can look on their About Us page. I can try to piece this together with who I think the different people are. But I'm seeing that 3, 4, 5 people from the same company all converting on our landing page at within an hour or 2 of each other. The great part is they're passing your stuff around. They're passing your lead gen. They're passing your event stuff around, and they're all registering. They're all showing high signs of interest in this. In a perfect world, 100% of the people that register would actually attend. But even without that, you're starting to get some insight as to who the different people are and the different job roles within the company. If you're smart on your form, you're also asking, like, hey, what's your biggest question or what's your biggest struggle when it comes to data center engineering and data center design? And you're trying to figure out, like, oh, this is interesting. 6 people have 6 completely different answers, or, oh, no, actually they are aligned pretty well. They're all saying pretty much the same thing. So there's a tremendous amount of insight that you can get in there for attracting and engaging and building helpful resources and educational learning experiences where they can learn with your experts about topics and challenges and goals that they're working on that help them do their job better. Now, how do you make sure that you are creating great resources and great educational events that help them learn how to do their job better to achieve their professional goals and address some of their biggest professional struggles? Well, not only are you doing the customer insight research to get the answers to those questions in their own words, but then you're looking and saying, okay, what kind of experts do they want to learn from? And do we have those experts internally? If we do, that's fantastic. Then you go to your internal expert and you say, hey, we discovered when we talk to the directors of data center development or chief investment officers or whatever it is for this kind of company, we discovered that they're struggling with these 6 biggest challenges and these 6 biggest goals. Out of these 12 topics, which do you feel comfortable talking about for 20 or 30 minutes? And they'll say like, oh, okay, yeah, these 3 I'm really strong on. These other 3 or 4 areas I don't get involved in very often, but we have a consulting firm, we have an architecture firm, whatever it is that we work with from time to time. And I bet they could supply someone who could talk about these 2 areas. We could bring them in as a guest expert. Like, oh, that's terrific. So what you're starting to do is chip away at getting buy-in for your educational events program. 12 goals, 12 challenges, 6 goals, 6 challenges, 12 topics. Tackle one of those a month and invite the right people. If there's 400 target accounts and there's 8 people in each of those target accounts, so there's 3,200 people you want to invite. If your classroom, your conference room comfortably sits 20 people, guessing like what your attendance rate is going to be on a free event. But if you can fill up that room with 15, 20 people every single month for 12 months in a row, magical things will happen with driving alignment in these companies, because you'll for sure get out of the vendor box. They're not just going to see you as an MEP infrastructure firm anymore. They're going to see you as an expert on anything and everything having to do with data center engineering and data center design that relates to their specific concerns within that project. Now, when you understand how you segment up your target accounts, when you understand how you segment up these buyer personas over time, you should discover that different kinds of stakeholders in these companies care about different kinds of issues. And that's good. You have a primary and a secondary buyer persona, maybe a tertiary buyer persona. So if you're doing one breakfast seminar a month for data center investment officers, and maybe you're doing another program, you discover another 12, 10 topics that are of high interest to people on the construction side or people on the finance side. Every Wednesday morning, reserve 2 hours, an hour and a half, whatever it is, in your classroom or conference room, and one segment at a time, chip away at building this massive positioning within these companies that positions your internal, your external subject matter experts as the be-all end-all experts when it comes to anything and everything having to do with data center engineering and data center design. For the people that you would love to attend that weren't able to make it there live, record it, make it available on demand. For people that don't want to watch it on demand and aren't able to easily drive to your location, run the same event virtually, run a webinar. You took the time to build the slides. You took the time to convince your internal subject matter expert to participate. Maybe you can convince him or her to give you another 45 or 60 minutes a month or 2 later when you run the same thing virtually. So at the end of the day, what all of this is about is educating and building trust. It's how we can differentiate. It's how we stand out in crowded marketplaces. And it's one of the most effective ways to attract and build mind share and dramatically influence the criteria that different kinds of stakeholders and different kind of companies use to evaluate the alternative options that are in front of them. So that's how I would approach. That's my general insight and advice, tips, and best practices for how a data center, a MEP infrastructure firm can attract engineering and design clients. So that's the final question that we'll be addressing in this week's Data Center Go-to-Market Sales and Marketing Q&A show. If you've got good value for this week's show, make sure to help spread the word by hitting the like button on whatever platform that you watch on. If you have an idea for a topic or a question or a challenge that you think we should address in an upcoming show, be sure to leave that in the comments and we'll add that to the consideration queue. If you want to make sure that you get notified about upcoming educational events and resources just like this, be sure to subscribe to the Data Center Sales and Marketing newsletter. That'll come to your email inbox each Sunday. You can sign up. You can subscribe directly on our website at www.dcsmi.com. And finally, if we are not currently connected on LinkedIn and you'd like to be, if you'd like to be a first degree connection of me on LinkedIn, I still have a few slots left. It's filling up fast. I guess when I get to that 30,000, we'll have to be a lot more selective on this ask. But if you want to be connected, just simply drop me a note. Make sure to mention in the invite that you attended or watched the Data Center Go-to-Market Sales and Marketing Q&A show, and I'd be happy to be connected with you on LinkedIn. I'm Joshua Feinberg from DCSMI. I also host the Data Center Go-to-Market podcast. So glad that you're able to join us this week for the Data Center Go-to-Market Sales and Marketing Q&A show. We wish you great success in growing your influence, your team's role, and your company's role in digital infrastructure, data centers, and critical facilities. Take care now and enjoy the rest of your day. Have a terrific week.
Data Center Go-to-Market Sales and Marketing Q&A is sponsored by DCSMI, elevating the role of sales marketing and go-to-market GTM professionals in the growth of the data center industry. To stay informed about upcoming episodes, subscribe to the Data Center Sales and Marketing newsletter on the DCSMI website at www.dcsmi.com. Again, that's www.dcsmi.com.